Well, my name is Denny Weaver. My current occupation is being a retired professor of theology. I spent 31 years at Bluffton University in Bluffton, Ohio, where I was in the religion department. 9 years of that I was chair. Since retiring 7.5 years ago, I've lived in Madison, Wisconsin, which I enjoy greatly, and my activity since retiring has been writing. And so the third major project that I've completed is this book, The Nonviolent God. How the story of Jesus is a saving story and how that impacts our lives today and what that says about the nature of God. In my mind, those are all different pieces of the same discussion. We just start with Jesus. Jesus is the one that we say is our Savior. And so to get to that point, I tell that story of Jesus who did activities. Those activities got him in trouble, and the religious authorities and the Romans killed him, and God raised him. And so that demonstrates that God is the God who restores life rather than taking life. And so that's the story of Jesus that reveals the character of God. And how is that, the way that's a saving story is we put ourselves in Jesus' story and we experience that same life with that same God who restores life instead of giving life. And so how that impacts our life today is that becomes a way to live in the Jesus story. And so whether we're telling a Jesus story, you can tell it as a saving story. You can tell it as a story that we live in today, so it impacts our life, or you can tell it as a story that shows who God is. God is the one who restores life when the forces of evil take life. So to me, I'm answering that set of questions in one ball. You just which piece of it do you want to peel off and talk about? But they're all interrelated.
You are also building upon your previous book, The Nonviolent Atonement, in which you subscribe to a particular, and I think came up with a particular atonement theory called narrative Christus Victor. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's actually from there that I get to talk about Nonviolent God. When I was developing that project, I didn't know I was going to end up talking about God. I thought I was just trying to develop an idea of atonement that didn't have the way that God supported violence, the way that violence appears in the traditional theories. And it was a number of steps. I'm not even sure over the years, a number of steps, I'm not even sure I could trace all them. But I came to see that the story of Jesus was a kind of Christus Victor. Christus Victor is the classic version. There are several versions of the classic version. It was, God was in conflict with the devil, and the devil killed Jesus, God's most precious possession. And it seemed to be a victory for the devil, but on the other side, God raised Jesus, and God is victorious over the devil. That's where you get victorious Christ, Christus Victor. But that was always, in the classic version, it was always what I pejoratively say, spooks in the sky. And I started to see, well, wait a minute, that conflict was really on earth. And you see it in the life of Jesus, confronting the various powers of evil around him. And so the conflict is visible in the narrative of Jesus. So I call it narrative Christus Victor to distinguish from classic Christus Victor. And then I went ahead and I said, wow, that's the way, if you read Revelation, the way it should be read, you read the first verse and it says it's about Jesus. It's about the word that God gave to Jesus to show John or something. It's a circular thing. It all comes back to Jesus. So you should be reading Revelation in terms of the narrative of Jesus. And you shouldn't see anything in Revelation that isn't visible in some way in that narrative. And so I see that even though Revelation has this fantastic, marvelous, exciting imagery, it's really imagery about the victory of Jesus on earth, confronting the powers of evil, symbolized by the Roman Empire, and the victory of God of raising Jesus. And so that's what narrative Christus Victor is. It's I think it's an earlier version of classic Christus Victor. it's classic Christus Victor has shored off the narrative, and you can talk about why that happened. But.
So I'm wrong to say that you came up with it.
Yeah.
This is something that you're ascribing to the early church, the earliest church.
What I did in my mind, I read what was in the Bible and put a name on it and abstracted a little bit, and it appeared to be new because we hadn't called it an atonement victory before, and we didn't have that name, narrative Christus Victor, before. Mm-hmm. But so I developed that theory, but in my mind, it's also just what you find when you read the Bible.
Can you contrast it with a moral exemplar theory?
Yeah, I'm often asked that because there is a lot of similarity. It's not more. I don't go with moral influence theory for two reasons. One, the idea is of a nonviolent God. A nonviolent God means God doesn't require violence or depend on violence to accomplish God's will, which is the problem with various versions of satisfaction atonement. You have to have God sending Jesus to die in order to somehow back satisfy God. And so there you have a God who either uses violence or depends on violence. And moral influence theory has the same problem. You have the God who shows love by giving the Son to die so that we sinners see how loving God is, how much God loves us. He's willing to have his Son killed for our benefit. And so you end up with a God who has this one of God's children killed in order to show love for the rest of God's children. So, moral influence has that idea of a violent God in it. The other version is it stops with the death of Jesus. The love of God is shown in the death of Jesus. And I think the end of the story is not the death, the end of the story is resurrection.
So what would you say is grace for a God who eschews violent punishment?
Grace is God's loving acceptance without payback. You notice the cover of the book is that glorious, brightly colored Chinese artist's painting of the prodigal son. And to me, when I thought about it, the parable of the prodigal son, basically is the one image that I can spin almost everything else off in the book. Because the Father never quit loving the Son. God never quits loving us, even when we run off and are sinful, and the Son ran off. And the Son finally came to his senses and came back. And the Father was waiting and loving like the Father always was, and the Father accepted him. And the prodigal did not have to work 20 years or before he could come back in the Father's graces or submit to punishment or restore all the money he lost. All these things he didn't. He was just accepted, period. And I think that is grace, forgiveness without payback. And it's not free grace, because the prodigal, to receive that, the prodigal had to make a change and come back. And there you have this interesting paradox, the paradox of grace. And I'm not a Calvinist by any stretch of the imagination, but I do believe that point about we can't save ourselves. If we're saved, it's because God saves us. And so that's out of the Calvinist, God elects us side. But we're also free agents who make decisions, and so we have to decide to accept that. And I just call that a paradox that we live in. They're both sides of that paradox are true. And there's a Bible verse that says it. When Paul says, I worked harder than any of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Paul, that's an expression of that. We can't do it ourselves, but on the other hand, yes, we did. And they're both true.
You give an impressive survey, or an impressively broad survey of the Bible in your exegesis, and address Old Testament, the most difficult passages in the Old Testament, the Gospels, Paul, and the Book of Revelation. And could you give us a couple of highlights from this broad spectrum of things? Most people, of course, are going to wonder about the taking of Canaan. If they're, that's the one that's most commonly brought up as a defense of the idea that the Bible portrays God as violent.
Yes. When I started to come to the conclusion, I really need to talk about God as nonviolent, because that's the God who's visible in Jesus. Well, the first big objection that comes up is, what about the Old Testament? And what I came to see, and I had a little bit of help from various people, is that yes, that violence is there, and it's very visible, and it's well known. But what the book shows is that's not denied, but there are other dimensions of it. I mean, there are other kinds of stories. There are stories of nonviolent confrontations, nonviolent activities. If you go back to Genesis, when you compare the Genesis accounts with the Enuma Elish, you see that Genesis really has a nonviolent God, and so the Bible starts with a God who creates either with word or playing in the dirt, and that's very different from a violent God. The Enuma Elish has those stories where the earth is the product of battles and slicing up a body and creating humans out of the blood of a rebellious God. So all at once you see the Bible started with a nonviolent God, and what happened. So we're tracing what happened to that, and that's where I come out and say, well, let's go back and talk to see which of these sides, both of which claim to speak for God, which of those comes to fruition in Jesus. If we say that God's revealed in Jesus, well, it's pretty obvious. So on the Canaan, taking of Canaan, I followed the literature that says those first 11 chapters of Joshua are pretty formulaic, and right after you get through with all those battle stories, it says there are Canaanites in the land, and so obviously they didn't kill everybody and take over the land like they said. There was a lot of so that's probably a conglomerate of literature, and there's a lot of osmosis and other kinds of moving into the land and stories of nonviolent conflict. One of my favorite ones is that one with Elisha or Elijah, where the Eerdmans, the king sends that army down to ambush, and with a word from the Lord, he keeps telling the king how to avoid the ambush. And the king gets so mad, he sends a big army down there to capture Elisha. And the story says, well, their eyes were blinded. He just didn't recognize him. And he comes out and says, well, I know where you're looking for. He's over here in Samaria. I'll take you over there and we'll find him. And he gets over there and gets him surrounded, and the Israelite king can hardly wait to engage in a massacre. And he says, no, feed him. And it says they feasted and sent him home, and the Eerdmans didn't come and raid anymore. So you have a very clear repelling of an invasion with a nonviolent activity. And so then you get to ask, well, which of those really reflects the God that's revealed in Jesus? If you believe that God's revealed in Jesus, and I thought that's what we always claimed.
You're really following, or somebody's following, a center of gravity shift in modern and especially younger Christianity, with people like Rob Bell and Shane Claiborne and quite a few others, Brian McLaren, and then there's Stanley Hauerwas and Jim Wallace and Walter Brueggemann, and all these men pushing in that direction. And I was just wondering, what's your sense of where things stand? Would you identify yourself with those sorts of shifts? Is there a way that you shouldn't do it? Or is it mostly? Well, I
can talk around that question a while. I've for quite a while started to think that we are in the midst of a major upheaval in theology, and we're in the midst of it, and each of us has got little pieces that we're working at what we can work at and try to push it, but we don't really see the whole. And I think 150 years from now, when somebody writes a history of theology of late 20th century, early 21st century, I think by then, and what I was going to say, this big matrix is moving around. There's new alliances, that aren't following traditional denominational lines, and they're not following traditional, evangelical versus this lines. The lines are being restructured, and we don't really quite understand where they're all going. But it's going to be a major reshuffling and new alliances that'll be visible 150 years from now, that'll be as significant as the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. But on these names that you mentioned, I think I'm in that kind of a category, and I think all of these, for various reasons, are starting to emerge, and I just really base it on the kind of responses that people have given me to my work in the last few years, particularly the Nonviolent Atonement since 2001 or 2000, and now when I've been giving lectures here and there on Nonviolent God, the people who come from mainline Protestant, which Stanley Hauerwas said its basic principle is be nice, those people are a little bit they come to me and they're a little bit disillusioned. They say, well, finally somebody's giving us something real to hold on to. It makes sense to be a Christian. It makes sense to read the Bible again. And on the other side, the evangelical side, those are the folks who up to this point have been very doctrinaire. You're saved by, believe the right thing, but it didn't have any impact on the way people lived, and it was too easy, ended up supporting the nationalism and wars. And so people got disillusioned from that on the other side, and those people come to me and says, wow, after I read your book, I decided to give the church another chance. And so I have people coming from those two sides. And I think it reflects for different reasons, one side on mainline Protestantism, the other side on evangelicals, just the sense that that traditional way of doing things didn't have much to say to the way people lived and didn't really address the problems in our world about violence and poverty and economic disparity and so on.
Yeah. Is there a specific audience that you're writing to, or is it?
That's tricky. I'm writing to everyone. The way that comes down. There have been people that accuse me of being sectarian while you're just talking about nonviolence. But I would say, well, no, wait a minute. I'm talking about Jesus, and if you take the nonviolence out of Jesus, you don't have that whole story. And so, I say, well, I'm writing to everybody that owns a Bible and says they believe in Jesus. Now, practically, I'm writing to the academic world, to theologians, and I hope they take it seriously, because those are the people that teach the people that are going to be pastors and more professors and church people. And I hope that pastors pick that up and preach it in their congregation. So I'm really, maybe it's a pipe dream, but I'm hoping you write to the academic world, eventually it filters down and impacts the way people live in their congregations.
Well, I don't think it's a pipe dream at all. I think it's already at work.
Well, I hope so.
I'm interested in how you read Hebrews. Especially Hebrews 10.
Yeah, Hebrews 10. That talks about Jesus as the high priest, and the high priest offering daily sacrifices, and then the high priest offered himself, and then you only have one sacrifice. You don't have the cycle of sacrifices stops. I go back and say, I'm not basing an atonement motif on a particular Bible verse. Or particular text, a particular chapter. I'm extracting it out of the story of Jesus. You know, whatever we talk about atonement is really a way of putting meaning on that story. And when I read that story, I don't see anything in that story about Jesus' death being needed by God or aimed at God or impacting God. And so I read but Jesus in that story, Jesus gave himself. You know, as I describe who, you know, that kind of a definition of Jesus, he's the one who made the reign of God visible. And to make the reign of God visible, it came to the point where he had to give up his life to do that. Sacrifice in terms of giving up, not sacrifice in terms of something offered to God. He gave up his life as the price of carrying out the mission. He could have saved his life, but then he wouldn't have fulfilled his mission. And so in that sense, you could say Jesus is like a high priest, but now it's giving himself in terms of, you know, he's carrying out a mission. Now I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but I come back around it another way. In the section where I talk about Christology, and I mentioned the 5 New Testament Christological images that John Yoder said, you know, where they took the New Testament, the version of Jesus that was in the five or six sermons in the book of Acts, and they took it into these different worldviews and used the language of that worldview to talk about who Jesus is. And one of those is the high priest. So it's very legitimate to use other different images to talk about the meaning of Jesus, and I think you can use the high priestly image in Hebrews to talk about Jesus giving up his life to carry out his mission. But I wouldn't I wouldn't say, oh, let's throw away everything you did and go back to satisfaction atonement because of Hebrews 10.
Well, thank you very much for coming and talking with us.
Well, it's my pleasure. I appreciate it. I like to talk about this stuff.